Across this series, we've seen Manly P. Hall as a seeker, a philosopher, a bridge to the ancient mysteries. He gave voice to forgotten wisdom and offered a vision of humanity's spiritual potential. But in the final years of his life, the story shifted. Hall's world grew smaller, stranger, and more urgent. He spoke of time running out, of knowledge being twisted, and of the dangers facing seekers of tomorrow. And then, in August 1990, he died under mysterious circumstances still debated to this day. Some say he carried secrets that were never meant to surface. Others claim his legacy was hijacked or silenced. After a lifetime unveiling mysteries, Hall himself became one. For centuries, whispers of hidden wisdom have echoed through ancient texts, secret societies, and sacred symbols. A wisdom said to transcend religion, empire, and even time itself. In the early 20th century, a young man with no formal education and no credentials somehow uncovered it. His name was Manly Palmer Hall, and what he discovered connects forgotten rituals, lost civilizations, occult orders, and the very architecture of the human mind. Whether you believe that the world is shaped by hidden hands or guided by higher truths, what Hall uncovered forces us to reconsider both. Hall's work asks a question that we can't ignore. What if the secrets of the past were never lost, only hidden in plain sight? The first half of Manly P. Hall's life made him a legend. The second half would test him, with new allies, hidden struggles, and shadows gathering at the edges of his world. To understand Hall's final chapter, we have to look at the woman who shared it with him, and her name was Marie Bauer Hall. Marie Bauer was born in Germany, immigrating to the United States after the First World War. From early on, she was driven by visions and a sense of destiny. She claimed that hidden beneath the hills of Los Angeles lay relics of a lost civilization, evidence, she believed, of Atlantean wisdom preserved in the Americas. When Marie Bauer met Hall in the 1930s, she was already married with children, and Hall himself was still married to his first wife, Faye. So their connection began as colleagues at the Philosophical Research Society. After Faye's tragic death, Marie gradually became his partner in life as well as in work. Marie arrived with her own sacred mission. She believed Los Angeles concealed relics of a lost civilization, a hidden vault, she claimed, that would rewrite history. She became convinced she had been chosen to unearth it. Hall, cautious but intrigued, gave her a place at the Philosophical Research Society, and though their approaches were different, his grounded in scholarship, hers in mystical visions, both shared the conviction that ancient wisdom lay just beyond humanity's grasp. Where Faye, Hall's first wife, represented tragedy, Marie brought turbulence.
Marie Bauer Hall's visit here to Williamsburg is designed to increase the pressure on Bruton Parish to allow a dig. But the vestry of this historic church remains unimpressed and determined to prevent this church from becoming some sort of mecca for New Age believers.
Been hearing so much about it, and now I thought I'd come over here myself and see what it's all about. And I think it's insane.
She was fiercely devoted, but also controversial. Her eccentric quests, digging for lost treasure, searching for coded messages and old texts, sometimes fueled Hall's reputation as a mystic sage, but sometimes undercut it.
Can prove it historically, philosophically, religiously, and then some. I dug up the foundation.
Still, the bond between them endured for decades. In the evenings, Marie would recount her visions. Hall would respond with stories of philosophy and myth. Theirs was a union of mysticism and scholarship, fueled by the conviction that there were truths just beyond humanity's reach, waiting to be revealed. Marie was a force. To her supporters, she was Hall's muse, a visionary who brought urgency and fire to his quiet philosophical nature. But to her critics, she was eccentric at best, destabilizing at worst. But whatever the truth, she shaped the final decades of his life, and her presence became inseparable from the story of his later years. In 1954, Hall was awarded the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite, the highest recognition in Freemasonry. However, this award was only honorary. It was just an acknowledgement of his life's work. Hall looked at it as public validation. To his admirers, it was a crowning achievement, confirming that his decades of study and writing had been acknowledged by the very fraternity he so often wrote about. But for others, this is proof enough that Hall was tied more deeply to secret orders than he ever admitted. And in his later years, as his warnings grew sharper, some began to wonder, was he speaking for the mysteries or against those who had taken them over? By the 1980s, Manly P. Hall was in his 80s. Decades of lecturing, writing, and leading the Philosophical Research Society had taken their toll. His health was frail, but his pace never slowed. If anything, it quickened. Those close to him recall a sense of urgency. Hall seemed to feel that time was running out, not just for himself, but for the world. He warned of a future where sacred knowledge would be known but could be twisted, used for power rather than wisdom. In his final lectures, he returned again and again to the same themes, that seekers must guard against deception, that spirituality could be corrupted by materialism or greed, that the mysteries preserved for a millennia were at risk of being lost, or worse, inverted and weaponized. From everything I've looked at, one of the most significant details of this period was that Hall was frantically moving backwards in his research. He was obsessively sifting through his earliest works, looking for something. In one lecture, The Secret of the 33rd Degree Mason, Hall warned that ancient symbols had been hijacked by the unworthy and the ambitious. He cautioned that the very emblems of enlightenment could be turned into tools of control. In another, he spoke of false teachers who would appear as guides but were in fact merchants of illusion. It was as if Hall was trying to leave warnings for the future. His words carried an edge of prophecy. He seemed less concerned with the past than with what was coming next. This urgency set the stage for the mysteries that would follow, because when Hall died in 1990, many believed he left behind unfinished work and questions that had no answers, notes scattered across his desk, references in his lectures, hints of projects never completed. Out of these fragments grew speculation. Some claimed that Hall had been preparing a final manuscript, a kind of hidden codex, a work so direct, so dangerous that it would expose the misuse of secret traditions in the modern world. Others believed Hall had gained access to secret archives, even the vaults of the Vatican. For years, he had hinted at treasures of knowledge locked away by institutions. Was he working and preparing to reveal what he had seen? Some whispered of relics, that Hall, through Marie or other channels, had uncovered Atlantean fragments, ancient maps, even objects from civilizations lost to history. If true, these would have shaken the foundations of archaeology and religion alike. And then there were the revelations that push past the limits of imagination, where the mystical meets the otherworldly, that Hall had been in contact with non-human intelligences, extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings, and that his warnings in those final lectures weren't just philosophical, but messages he felt compelled to pass on. A few even insisted Hall was preparing to reveal evidence that history itself was cyclical, that Atlantis had risen and fallen, and that we were poised to repeat its fate. None of this could ever be proven, but the fragments he left behind, scribbled notes, unfinished lectures, they were enough to spark decades of speculation. For his admirers, Hall passed into legend, but for others, he had become part of the very mythos he once tried to decode. On August 29, 1990, Manly Palmer Hall died at the age of 89. But what exactly happened that day depends on whose story you believe. The official account reported in the LA Times was simple. Hall died in his sleep in his LA home. The Philosophical Research Society stated the cause, according to the coroner, was heart failure. Peaceful, ordinary, the passing of a man at the end of a long life. But his inner circle gave a very different account. Those closest to Hall tell a very different story. They insist he did not die at home. Instead, they say his body was found in the back of an RV in the desert. He had been taken there by caretakers, and by the time he was discovered, it was too late. The RV story offers a massive discrepancy from the original story. And to understand how this could have been allowed to happen, we have to step back. In his last years, new figures entered and left his life. Some offered loyalty and care. Others would bring a different presence, one that would change everything. In the 1980s, two young seekers, Ronnie Pontiac and Tamara Lucid, found their way to the Philosophical Research Society. They were first hired as screeners and research assistants to Hall, tasked with helping him manage the flood of correspondence and projects that came through his office. But what began as work quickly grew into friendship. Ronnie and Tamara became close companions to both Hall and Marie. They helped drive the Halls to lectures, organize their daily tasks, and were welcomed into their lives not just as staff, but as family. Ronnie and Tamara described this period as one of deep connection. They felt the Halls were surrounded by genuine care, and that Hall, despite his age, was still sharp, still working, and still hopeful. To them, the official obituary was a cover. They believed that Hall's final days were marked by neglect, or something worse, that he may have been silenced before he could publish what he was working on. But then another figure appeared. His name was Fritz, a caretaker who came into the Halls' lives and quickly took control. Accounts of Fritz paint him as domineering and dangerous. He isolated the Halls, pushing aside loyal friends like Ronnie and Tamara. He positioned himself as indispensable, even as others began to fear his influence. Marie, Ronnie, and Tamara all left accounts of those final years, and their stories paint a chilling picture of the man who had inserted himself into the Hall's life. Marie described Fritz as manipulative, a man who cut her off from her husband, controlled her household, and cared only for money. Ronnie remembers him as physically intimidating, prone to threats, and openly abusive. Tamara recalls his temper and the fear he created in their home. To all three, Fritz's presence marked the turning point. It was under his care that Hall was isolated from his allies. And it was with Fritz that Hall took the trip into the desert, where he would later draw his final breath in the back of an RV. Tamara specifically took a stand against Fritz. She had been Hall's screener for years and saw a number of red flags in him right off the bat. She attempted to warn Hall in private many times, to the point where she would become emotional. But this display of emotion caused Hall to shut these conversations down.
We both, we went back to Manly Hall and said, this guy is bad news. And Tamara was emphatic. I mean, she became hysterical the third time she warned him. which was the last time we ever saw Manly Hall, she actually started crying because she was like, why won't you listen to me? I'm telling you, this guy's going to hurt you.
In time, Ronnie and Tamara were forced out. With them went the sense of protection the Halls had relied on. In their place, Fritz and his associates grew more powerful, and as Hall's health declined, those around him were no longer the people who had stood by him for years, but new figures whose motives remain in question. This is the context for Hall's final days. On August 29, 1990, Hall was not in his Los Angeles home, as PRS would later claim. Marie says the final vacation began Sunday, August 26, 1990. She, Hall, Fritz, whom she calls a supposed physiotherapist, and his son left in an RV to attend a speaking engagement for Marie. There was no real reason for them to go through the desert. It would have been quicker for them to just stay on the main road. She described Fritz as adding a heavy trailer to the RV for his car. The extra weight, she warned, would cause engine trouble. On their way, Fritz pulled over claiming overheating. Marie was the one set to speak at the event, so she was persuaded to journey on so that she wouldn't miss it. Fritz played right into her vanity. He assured her that everybody would be fine and that the audience needed to hear what Marie was set to speak on. So she left in a car, leaving Manly P. Hall with Fritz and his son in a broken-down RV in the desert. From that point, Marie says she was kept at a distance. She recounts phone calls where Fritz assured her that Hall was sleeping and they'd bring him home the next morning. Marie believes that Manly P. Hall died that night on August 28th while she was away in or around the RV. When Marie returned home late morning August 29th, she says she found Hall's body on a stretcher in their living room and professional carpet cleaners running machines in the bedroom and hall while the body was still in the house. What she's saying is that Hall died in the RV, and his body was transported back home to LA without anyone calling authorities to the scene. Marie describes the state of Hall's remains as shocking. Ants crawling in his mouth, ears, and eyes. To her, evidence that he had been left in the heat long enough for insects to set in. She also says cremation had been arranged without her consent, and that Dr. Pollock was asked to sign a death certificate later rescinded due to inconsistencies. Marie says she halted the cremation and pushed for an autopsy. Marie says that 6 days before Hall's death, August 23, 1990, he was induced to sign estate papers shifting control to a trust managed by Fritz. This is not just Marie's memory. Court filings and subsequent reporting document the dispute. Hall died 6 days after signing, and years of litigation followed over control of PRS assets. So we're left with two irreconcilable narratives: the PRS version, a peaceful passing at home, and the insider version, an RV in the desert, isolation, neglect, and a cover-up, with the visceral detail of ants on the body when it was finally brought home.
My gut feeling is that he saw it coming, and it's not just a gut feeling, because Tamara, when she was doing research for her book, found this reference. He referred to Fritz as the Lord High Executioner.
If Daniel Fritz was just a caretaker, why would anyone suspect him of harm? To Marie, Ronnie, and Tamara, the answer was clear. He had both motive and opportunity. Marie insisted Hall was senile, coerced into signing papers he didn't understand. For her and her allies, the timing was too convenient to be ignored. PRS was Hall's life's work. Whoever controlled him in his final days could position themselves to control PRS after his death. By pushing Ronnie, Tamara, and Marie out, Fritz gained influence over who saw Hall, what he worked on, and how his legacy would be managed. To Hall's friends, it looked like the mysteries and the esoteric information were up for grabs. Ronnie and Tamara describe Fritz as volatile, domineering, physically intimidating. To them, he thrived on control.
People often dismiss him based on it. They say, well, if he was so wise, then how come he let a guy like Fritz take advantage of him like that? How come he didn't see it coming? And I think that that's a gross oversimplification of what was happening there. I think that there was some sort of possibly at least elder abuse going on with this man. And I know that from my own experiences with Fritz, that he was trying to maintain total control over Manly Hall and got in the way of not just me, but other people who were trying to make sure that the halls were safe.
Even if we leave aside the darker theories, the picture is bleak. A frail 89-year-old, isolated from his friends and family, kept dependent, while key papers were signed and his world narrowed to a handful of men who controlled his every move. And then the RV. For Marie, it was the ultimate red flag. Why would anyone take a man in Hall's condition on such a trip? Marie believed that the engine overheating was no accident, that Fritz deliberately created a crisis to strand Hall in the desert, away from her. If his death was due to gross negligence, the obituary's peaceful passing at home protected everybody involved. To some, Fritz's motives were obvious: money, power, control. But for others, the circumstances of Hall's death suggest something deeper, something hidden. Hall's closest friends insist he was racing against time in his final years. For those who believe this, Fritz's role wasn't just to control Hall, it was to silence him before the work could be completed. Marie pointed out the strange details. Hall's death announced only after a 72-hour delay. Professional cleaners running machines in the hallway while his body still lay in the house. To some, this looks less like routine and more like a ritual cleanup. Esoteric researchers see echoes of ceremonial timing, the idea that Hall's passing was aligned to hidden rhythms and then cleansed from the record. The estate itself carried mythic weight, not just $10 million in assets, but a vast library of rare manuscripts, artifacts, and archives. To conspiracy-minded observers, PRS wasn't simply an institute. It was a treasure house. Whoever controlled it would control access to knowledge that Hall had guarded for half a century. And then there's the desert itself. The official story says that Hall died at home in LA. Marie swore he died in an RV under blistering heat, his body left long enough for ants to crawl into his eyes and mouth. To some, that desert isn't just circumstance, it's symbolic. A sage taken away from his sanctuary, abandoned in the wilderness, and erased from his own story. Finally, there were those who believed Fritz wasn't acting alone, that he was a pawn, an instrument of a larger network that wanted Hall out of the way. Was it opportunism, or was it the hand of secret orders? Or was it simply the cruel fate of an old man in the wrong care? None of it was ever proven, but to this day, the two stories of Hall's death refuse to merge. One paints a peaceful passing, the other a cover-up layered with money, power, ritual, and secrecy. Which story we believe depends on who we trust. The institution Hall founded, or the people closest to him who say they were pushed out toward the end. Two stories, one a peaceful end, one a mystery. And 3 decades later, the truth remains contested. In the years after his death, the stories around Manly P. Hall multiplied. Some whispered he'd never truly died, that his death was staged, his body a decoy, his spirit moving underground to continue the work in secret. Others cast Hall as a reincarnated sage, a soul who had walked with the earth many times before, and whose death was only a doorway to return again. Still others leaned into the fantastical, that Hall was a time traveler slipping between centuries, or that he had been in contact with aliens and interdimensional beings, passing on messages not his own. The myths overtook the man, but not everybody agreed. Ronnie Pontiac, who knew Hall personally in his last years, has often warned against these distortions. He insists that Hall was not a magician or a prophet from another planet, but a teacher, a man devoted to knowledge, clarity, and the elevation of human consciousness. Hall himself had warned against false teachers and illusions, and in death he became the subject of the very forces he had cautioned seekers to resist, the temptation to turn wisdom into myth and the teacher into a legend. After Hall's death, PRS struggled. Marie Bauer Hall was sidelined, and disputes over Hall's estate tore at the institution he had built. But PRS survived. It transformed, carrying fragments of Hall's vision into a new century. Beyond PRS, Hall's influence spread wide. His writings seeded the New Age movement, inspired generations of seekers, and quietly shaped the way millions approach esotericism, symbolism, and spiritual philosophy. His voice is echoed in podcasts, YouTube channels, and Instagram reels, sometimes without his name even being attached. In the end, the seeker became the mystery. And like all mysteries, Hall's story is less about answers and more about the questions we're left to pursue. The mysteries don't end with one man's life. They move through generations, waiting for those with the courage to look deeper. And that's what Manly P. Hall gave us. Not concrete answers, but the invitation to look deeper, and the tools to uncover what our souls have forgotten.
We cannot change the infinite, but we don't need to, because the infinite is right, and we have no rightness greater. And the infinite is infinite love, infinitely manifested throughout infinite time and infinite space. And in this divine love, we live. And as we live it, gradually it moves into us and becomes this radiant body of the soul. And the soul is the love in us, becoming the love in humanity for all that lives.
This is Hall of Mysteries, and the veil has lifted.